You'd assume a bookmaker is a professional gambler, someone who studies matchups, reads injury reports, understands momentum and home field advantage better than you do, and uses that edge to take your money when you're wrong. That's the story that makes intuitive sense, and it's almost completely false. A well-run sportsbook doesn't need to know anything about sports at all. It needs to know something about math and something about human psychology. And if it does those two things correctly, it will turn a profit whether the favorite wins by 30 points or loses outright. Understanding how that's possible tells you almost everything about how this industry actually works, and why the people who've run it successfully have spent decades getting chased, prosecuted, and occasionally imprisoned for something that, depending entirely on which island you're standing on, might not even be a crime. Start with the number that makes the entire business model work, the VIG. When you see a football spread priced at minus 110 on both sides, that number isn't describing a 50-50 coin flip with a small fee attached. It's doing something subtler. A minus 110 price implies that the sportsbook thinks that side has roughly a 52.4% chance of covering. Price both sides of the same bet at 52.4%, and you get a market that adds up to 104.8% instead of 100%. That extra 4.8% is the house's built-in margin, baked directly into the price rather than charged as a separate fee. It's called the VIG, short for vigorish, and it's the single most important number in the entire industry, because it means the bettor isn't just trying to guess the outcome correctly. They're trying to guess correctly, often enough to overcome a mathematical headwind before they've placed a single wager. Here's what that actually looks like in practice. If a book takes $110,000 in bets on one team and $110,000 on the other, at standard minus 110 pricing, it pays out $210,000 to whichever side wins and keeps $10,000 regardless of the outcome. The book didn't predict anything. It didn't need to. It just needed the action to be roughly balanced, and the math did the rest. That $10,000 on $220,000 wagered works out to about 4.5%, a figure known as the hold, and it's remarkably stable on efficient, heavily bet markets like NFL spreads. It's not stable everywhere, though, and that inconsistency turns out to matter a great deal. Player props and futures bets, where a book has far less information and far less competitive pressure to sharpen its pricing, routinely carry a hold of 15%, 20%, sometimes over 30%. The bet that feels the most fun and the most personal, guessing how many receiving yards your favorite player will rack up, is usually the one where the house is taking the biggest cut, precisely because it's the hardest market for anyone, including the book itself, to price accurately. So the obvious question becomes, if the VIG guarantees profit on balanced action, what happens when the action isn't balanced? This is where the popular image of a bookmaker as a fortune teller completely falls apart, and where the real skill of the job reveals itself. A sportsbook doesn't want to predict who wins. It wants to attract equal money on both sides of a bet, because that's the only condition under which the VIG is a mathematical certainty rather than a gamble. When the public suddenly piles onto one team, say after a viral highlight or a nostalgic hometown storyline, the book doesn't sit there hoping the other team wins to bail it out. It moves the line. It makes betting the popular side less attractive and the unpopular side more attractive, nudging the action back toward balance. The line isn't really a prediction about who's going to win. It's a pricing tool designed to manipulate where money flows, the same way a store might drop the price on unsold inventory to move it off the shelves. When you see a spread shift from -3 to -4.5 over the course of a week, you're not watching expert analysts recalculate the true probability of victory. You're watching a company manage its exposure. This is where a second, uglier truth about the business starts to surface, and it's one that most casual bettors never think about. Not everyone who places a wager with a sportsbook is treated the same way. There's a category of bettor known in the industry as sharp, someone whose bets are informed enough and consistently profitable enough that a book treats their action as genuinely useful information, rather than just cash coming through the door. When a sharp bettor hammers one side of a line early, before the public has weighed in, a well-run book pays close attention, because that bet is functioning as a kind of free, highly informed forecast. Books quietly use this signal to adjust their own pricing before the broader public even knows the line has moved. In a real sense, some of the sharpest sports analysis in the world isn't happening in a broadcast booth. It's happening inside a sportsbook's own trading operation, reverse engineered from where the smartest, most disciplined bettors are putting their money. But here's the part that inverts the whole picture of what a good customer looks like. If a bettor keeps winning consistently, a book doesn't celebrate them as proof its lines are fair. It restricts them. Limits get lowered, accounts get flagged. In extreme cases, they get banned outright. The customer the book actually wants isn't the accurate one. It's the confident one. The house doesn't care whether you're right. It cares whether your money, combined with everyone else's money, is roughly balanced, and whether the person placing that money is unlikely to be sharp enough to threaten that balance over time. This is the first real crack in the gambler versus gambler myth. A sports book, properly run, behaves less like your opponent at a poker table and more like a casino running a table game with a fixed house edge, occasionally kicking out the one player smart enough to count cards. None of this explains why Offshore is even part of the story, though, and that's where things stop being about math and start being about geography, and where the real tension in this entire industry lives. For most of American history, sports betting outside a small handful of states was federally restricted, primarily through a law called PASPA, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, passed in 1992. Nevada was effectively grandfathered in as the one legal home for sports wagering, while the rest of the country was, on paper, locked out. But demand for sports betting didn't respect that law, and neither did technology. The rise of the internet in the mid-1990s created an obvious workaround. If you couldn't legally run a sportsbook inside the United States, you could run one somewhere else entirely and simply let American bettors connect to it online. This is exactly what a young options trader named Jay Cohen did in 1996, and his story is worth walking through in detail because it's essentially the origin story for the entire modern offshore betting industry. Cohen had been working as a trader on an options exchange in San Francisco, and by his own account, the leap from pricing financial derivatives to pricing sports outcomes wasn't as large as it might sound. Both jobs are fundamentally about assigning probabilities and managing risk across a large number of transactions. He and two partners moved to Antigua, the small Caribbean nation where sports betting was legal and regulated, and founded World Sports Exchange, or WSEX. They weren't hiding. They obtained an Antiguan gambling license, operated openly, and structured the business specifically to comply with the laws of the jurisdiction where it was based. The business didn't just survive, it exploded. Within a few years, WSEX was reportedly processing several times the combined betting volume of the traditional Las Vegas sportsbooks. And this is the detail that tells you everything about how influential the operation became. Las Vegas books started setting their own lines based on where WSEX's lines were moving. A sports book operating out of a small Caribbean island had effectively become the reference point that the entire established American gambling industry looked to for pricing information. That is not a small gray market side hustle. That's a company that had, by pure market force, become one of the most important price setters in global sports betting. And that success is precisely what made it a target. So according to Cohen's own account, professional sports leagues, the NFL, NBA, NHL, and MLB among them, were deeply uncomfortable with the growth of legalized offshore betting on their games, and pressure from those leagues, channeled through a politically connected law firm, is reported to have played a role in pushing federal prosecutors toward building a case. In 1998, Cohen was indicted under the Wire Act of 1961, a law written decades before the internet existed, originally aimed at telephone-based bookmaking operations, now being stretched to cover online wagers, routed through fiber optic cables that didn't exist when the statute was drafted. Cohen made the decision that, in hindsight, defined the rest of his life. He returned to the United States to stand trial, confident that operating legally within Antigua's regulatory framework would protect him. It didn't. In 2000, he was convicted, becoming the first person in American legal history convicted for running an offshore sportsbook. The core legal argument the courts ultimately accepted wasn't about where Cohen's company was located. It was about where the bettor was located when the wager was placed. The bets weren't happening on a server in the Caribbean. Legally speaking, they were happening on the telephone or internet connection of the person placing them, sitting in New York, and New York didn't allow it. Cohen was sentenced to 21 months in federal prison, which he served not on some tropical island, but in a federal facility in Nevada, the one U.S. state where the business he'd built would have been entirely legal. This is where the story could have simply ended. It's a cautionary tale about a pioneer crushed by more powerful interests. But it didn't end there. and the aftermath reveals something important about how thoroughly a determined black or gray market resists actual elimination. Cohen's partner stayed behind in Antigua and kept World Sports Exchange running for another 16 years after his conviction. The prosecution of the company's most visible face didn't shut the business down. It removed one person from American soil and left the underlying operation and the underlying demand completely intact. That's a pattern worth holding on to because it repeats throughout the rest of this story. Going after individual operators is expensive, slow, and largely symbolic against an industry whose actual product, the willingness of millions of people to bet on sports, never goes away no matter how many prosecutions happen. For the better part of 2 decades after Cohen's conviction, offshore sportsbooks operated in a strange kind of equilibrium. American law targeted operators, not individual bettors, a distinction that matters enormously. The Wire Act was written to shut down the business of bookmaking, not to criminalize the person placing a $50 bet on their phone. That legal asymmetry meant millions of Americans continued using offshore books throughout this period with essentially zero personal legal risk, while the companies running those books lived with a persistent, if inconsistently enforced, threat of federal prosecution. Estimates from that era, cited by the American Gaming Association, suggested Americans were wagering somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 billion a year through unregulated channels, offshore books, illegal local bookies, and informal betting networks combined. Whatever the precise figure, and industry estimates like this vary considerably depending on methodology and year, the scale was clearly enormous, dwarfing the legal Nevada market by a wide margin. Then, in 2018, the entire foundation shifted. The Supreme Court struck down PASPA in a case called Murphy versus NCAA, ending the federal prohibition and handing sports betting regulation to individual states. This is the moment where you'd expect the offshore industry to simply evaporate. After all, the entire reason it existed was to serve a demand that American law refused to serve domestically. If that demand could suddenly be met legally, inside the country, with consumer protections and licensed operators, why would anyone keep using an unregulated site based in Costa Rica or Curacao? The reality turned out to be more complicated, and this is the counterintuitive turn that separates the surface-level story from what's actually happening in the industry today. Legal sports betting in the United States did explode. In 2025 alone, licensed U.S. sportsbooks processed over $145 billion in total wagers, part of more than $600 billion bet legally since PASPA fell. With that legal market consolidated with startling speed into the hands of a very small number of companies. FanDuel and DraftKings alone now control roughly 78% of the American market, and adding BetMGM pushes that figure to over 90%. A market that briefly looked like it might become wide open and competitive, instead became something closer to a duopoly with a strong third player, and duopolies, freed from serious competitive pressure, tend to behave in ways that create new gaps for alternatives to exploit. That's exactly what happened. As state tax rates on sports betting climbed, and some states reaching as high as 33% of gross revenue, the dominant legal operators responded the way any rational business responds to rising costs. They widened their own hold, tightened betting limits, and became increasingly aggressive about restricting or banning winning bettors. The national average hold across legal U.S. sportsbooks climbed from roughly 7.25% in 2018, the year PASPA fell, to nearly 10% by 2025, a shift that represents billions of dollars quietly extracted through pricing, rather than through any change in how games are actually played. In other words, the legal industry that was supposed to make offshore betting obsolete ended up recreating some of the exact frustrations. Worse odds, tighter limits, aggressive restriction of skilled bettors that had pushed people toward unregulated books in the first place. This is the domino effect worth pausing on, because it explains something that looks, at first glance, like it shouldn't be possible. Offshore sportsbooks didn't just survive the legalization of their entire industry. By some estimates, they're still processing roughly $15 billion a year in American action, nearly a decade after the supposed disruption of full legalization. They adapted by becoming the alternative to the legal market's own excesses. Where domestic books restrict sharp bettors almost immediately, many offshore operations tolerate them far longer, because an offshore book competing for market share against entrenched giants has less incentive to protect margin at the expense of volume. Where domestic sportsbooks are bound by state-specific licensing and can't operate in states without legal betting, offshore books ignore state lines entirely. Where domestic operators are tied into the traditional banking system and subject to state tax reporting, offshore books widely adopted cryptocurrency for deposits and withdrawals, sidestepping the 2006 law, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, that specifically targeted the banking side of unlicensed gambling by pressuring credit card companies and banks to block transactions, rather than targeting the bettor directly. And the story isn't finished evolving, which brings the chain reaction full circle. In April 2026, a federal appeals court ruling opened the door to something called prediction markets, platforms that let people trade contracts on the outcomes of sporting events, structured to fall under federal commodities regulation rather than state gambling law. Functionally, betting on whether a specific team wins looks almost identical, whether you call it a wager or a contract. But the regulatory categories are completely different, and different regulatory categories mean different tax obligations, different licensing requirements, and different rules about who can operate where. DraftKings, watching this development closely, has reportedly committed roughly $300 million to building out its own prediction market products in 2026. Essentially hedging against the possibility that an entirely new, less regulated category of sports wagering is about to do to the current legal sportsbook framework exactly what offshore operators did to Nevada's old monopoly 30 years earlier. The pattern that started with Jay Towen exploiting a gap between what the law said and what people wanted to do is, in a very real sense, still playing out today, just with new regulatory categories instead of new Caribbean islands. So what does all of this actually reveal about the business at its core? Not that offshore sportsbooks are simply criminal enterprises preying on gamblers, and not that they're scrappy folk heroes serving an underserved market either. The honest picture sits somewhere less dramatic and more structurally interesting than either story. An offshore sportsbook, run well, is fundamentally a business built on collecting a small mathematically guaranteed toll on human disagreement. One side of the country thinks the Chiefs win, the other side thinks they lose, and the book profits from the simple fact that people disagree, regardless of who turns out to be right. The skill isn't sports knowledge. It's balancing risk, managing information asymmetry between sharp and public bettors, and constantly adjusting to a regulatory landscape that keeps redrawing the line between legal and illegal in ways no single operator fully controls. That last part is really the deepest truth buried in Jay Cohen's story, and in the industry's slow evolution since. Cohen didn't lose because his business model was flawed. His model was so effective that Las Vegas started copying his prices. He lost because he mispriced a completely different kind of risk, the legal one. He assumed that operating within the letter of Antiguan law would protect him from American prosecution, and he was wrong, in a way that cost him nearly 2 years of his life. The industry he helped invent went on to become fully legal in most of the country within a generation, generating well over $500 billion in legal wagers and turning 2 American companies into the dominant force in a business that decades earlier had been federally illegal outside a single state. Cohen himself, by some accounts, was later turned down for a job at one of those companies. The math he built his entire business around, a small guaranteed edge collected regardless of outcome, worked exactly as designed. The one bet he couldn't hedge was on which side of a shifting legal line his own life would end up standing.